All right, y'all. And I promise this time this is the last video you'll have to watch of me during the school day because I will be back on Friday. It is official. Unfortunately, I was unable to procure a negative test on Monday, and that meant that I had to stay home until the 10 days were up. So here I am for the final time giving you a quick little video lecture, this time on the shared phenomena that really goes hand in hand with industrialization, and that's immigration and urbanization. So today's quick lecture is titled America Moves to the City, Immigration, Urbanization, and then coming with it, urban reform here in the Gilded Age. So I'm going to first talk about immigration, who this new wave of immigrants are, where they're coming from, what characteristics they have. Very importantly, how that differs from former waves of immigration, thinking about like the Margaret Revolution, the Irish, the German wave of immigration. We'll then talk about kind of how that merges with Americans moving to cities and what kind of problems that creates in urban environments. And then we'll talk a little bit towards the end at responses to immigration, one of which is urban reform. So your handout should be in front of you. I'm going to try to make this as brief and straightforward as possible so you can spend more time engaging with the text. And we're good to go. So when we talk about immigration in the Gilded Age, it's important that we refer to this era as quote unquote new immigration. Now, in order to understand new immigration, let me give you a quick review on what old immigration is. Now, old immigration really goes hand in hand in tandem with the market revolution, right? Immigrants coming from Northern and Western Europe, so Ireland, Germany, England, right? The whites, people, immigrants that look like this guy. Northern Western Europe, the British Isles, Germany, Ireland. And in general, they are most likely Protestant, meaning not Catholic Christians. For the most part, they spoke English, which makes it easier to assimilate. They have higher levels of literacy, so they're able to read and write at a more advanced level. And for the most part, they had some sort of skill, whether it be farming, sewing, some sort of skill that allowed them to fit more easily into American society because they look similar, because they come from at least moderately similar countries, because immigration is more expensive. The poorest of the poor do not come, of course, not rich people are coming, but not the poorest of the poor because it's more expensive to come to America. And we really associate this wave with the market revolution. Now, it's important to note that even though they have all these things working for them in terms of assimilating into society, as we discussed in period 4, this wave of immigrants still experiences nativism. Of course, nativism is a term we used last semester. It's important to remember it for today. Nativism, of course, refers to anti-immigrant sentiments. Anti-immigrant sentiments, which are targeted specifically to the Irish. Now, why the Irish? Because the Irish in general are not Protestant and are instead more aligned with Catholicism. Now, after the Civil War, America is going to experience massive industrialization, as we've already discussed in this class. Now, this massive industrialization, in tandem with some push factors like revolutions, war, and famine in Europe, is going to push a new wave of immigrants to America that are markedly different than the old immigrants, which is why they're referred to as new immigration. This wave is going to really get going in the 1870s and is going to only increase into the early 1900s. It's going to be stopped eventually by immigration restrictions right after World War I that we'll talk about in period 7. Now, these new immigrants are largely from Southern and Eastern Europe. Places like Italy, Greece, Croatia, Russia, Poland, and also Asia that are going to look different than the white Americans that are dominant in American society. They're going to be much, much poorer as it gets cheaper and cheaper to migrate, much more illiterate, much less educated, far fewer formal education, far fewer knowledge and understanding that's going to allow them to assimilate into mainstream American society. Excuse me. Additionally, they're going to come from, it's going to be important for later, they're going to come from autocratic countries, countries with an autocrat like a king or an emperor or some sort of a lord ruler. So they're going to come with very, very little familiarity with democracy. They're going to come to America not necessarily having any sort of background information for what a representative government means, where you vote for people that represent your interests. And it's going to lead to things like political machines, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Further, they're really not nearly as Protestant, more Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Jewish religions and denominations that are not Protestant, which is the mainstream thread of Christianity in society at the time. And they're not going to assimilate for the most part. They're going to cram into lower class, poor, what we call ethnic neighborhoods, where they're going to settle with people that are from the same country or even the same region as they are from. Right? We're going to see like Little Italy and Chinatown, right? And they're not going to necessarily attempt to assimilate into society. They're going to instead build their own little enclaves within these rapidly growing cities in which they're going to be able to maintain some semblance of their own former culture from before. So those are the key differences. One key similarity to note, if you'd like, is the strong existence of nativism, anti-immigrant sentiment for both. But other than that, there's a marked shift in the type of immigrant that is coming to America in this era, and that's significant. Now, here's some data, some numbers to back it up. We're going to see 16 million immigrants. 16 million immigrants come to America in the last half of the 19th century. So from 1850 to 1900, 16 million immigrants come. But in the next 10 years, it's 9 million. So half of that happens in the next 10 years. So it's important to understand like this is a rapid increase in immigration really after the Civil War. As you see, this is my blue line that I'm tracing here in front of you. Those are immigrants coming from Northern and Western Europe. As you can see, right after the Civil War, that's the dominant immigration group. That's going to decline after the 1880s. While during and after the 1880s, the immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe is going to increase significantly into the early part of the 1900s. So it's important that we understand kind of this shift, right? Where America goes from a immigrant society that's dominated by Northern and Western Europeans that look like this guy, to Southern and Eastern Europeans who look different, come from different countries, different experiences, different foundational understandings on democracy and education and the like. And that's going to really kind of change the fabric, the makeup of American society forever, to the point that today, right, we're an incredibly diverse nation of all sorts of people. And that really is going to begin because of the Gilded Age. Now, going hand in hand with this immigration is going to be urbanization, because for the most part, this wave of immigrants is going to settle in cities. In 1860, the year that Lincoln is elected and the Civil War gets kicked off, only 1 in 5 Americans live in cities. Just 40 years later, as the Gilded Age has really transformed American society, that number has doubled. And that 40% of a way bigger population, right? Keep in mind that 40% is comparable in terms of percentage, but population has gone way up. And in that increase in population, so too has the percentage of Americans that live in cities by 1900. By 1920, so 20 years later, for the first time in American history, and we've never gone back, the majority of Americans are going to live in cities. Now, a quarter of these immigrants, 25%, are referred to as birds of passage, birds of passage. And that's a phrase used to describe an immigrant who comes to America for a few months, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, to make as much money as possible, and then go back to their mother country to try to improve their family's lives there. That's going to cause it's going to cause an increase in anti-immigrant sentiment, because the feeling is that they're not investing in American society and they're sending their money back to their home country. And there will eventually be laws passed against this type of immigration later in American society. Now, it's important to note that as these immigrants are coming in large numbers and settling in cities in large numbers, that's going to provide a very, very cheap, easy labor force for industrial capacity. For the most part, these people are coming to America for jobs and opportunities. For the most part, they're going to be willing to work for less than native-born Americans. And that's going to be one reason why many labor activists, these labor unions that are trying to get better wages, fewer hours, better, safer working conditions, one of the reasons why they're going to struggle with that is because this immigrant population, which is going to be one main reason why labor activists, specifically in organizations like the American Federation of Labor, are going to be anti-immigrant because of this. Now, this data just kind of shows us the way these cities grow significantly. LA, right, it goes from a tiny little town in 1870 to over 100,000 people by 1900. Boston doubles. Chicago goes over 4 times growth. New York doubles to 3.5 million people. So significant growth for many of the biggest cities in America that we recognize today as still industrial centers. Now, the tandem shift that's happening in this era, right? Industrialization is one, immigration is the other. The third is urbanization. It's important to understand that all three trends reinforce each other. Now, urbanization and industrialization are going to develop simultaneously, right? Because factories are built near cities, and then cities grow near factories. So it's going to kind of be a cycle that repeats itself, with immigration supplementing the labor forces that build cities and factories. Cities are going to provide laborers that are a workforce, a labor force for factories, and on the back end, a market, right? Because if cities are big places where you can market goods, you can advertise goods, you can sell goods, these urban centers are going to become both places of labor sources and markets to buy back these goods. Now, it's not just immigrants that are moving to cities. We see a lot of Americans moving from the South and from rural areas in the North also to northern cities, leaving their farms because having a hard time keeping up with bonanza farms, which is that term we used earlier in this unit for big commercial farms that can mass produce wheat and grain and the like. So we're going to see a lot of Americans, not just immigrants, also moving into cities for industrial jobs, commercial jobs, those middle-class managerial jobs that I talked about last week. And like I already alluded to, these new immigrants are often going to form what we call ethnic neighborhoods, where they will maintain elements of the culture of their former homeland. Now, there's going to be a lot of problems that are associated with this massive and rapid and aggressive growth of cities. I'll talk about all these problems. One of the problems is going to be political machines. So mark that down as a problem that I'm going to come back to in a little bit, and what's called boss politics. Keep this in mind as one of the consequences of this wave of immigrants coming to America that is not familiar with the ideas of democracy. But other problems are more tangible, more visible, more obvious to the naked eye, one of which is overcrowding. Our society has not invested in the type of infrastructure to deal with massive urban growth. So as urban areas both increase in population and size, we see an inability of local governments to do things like pave new roads, build new plumbing, maintain public health. And that's going to lead to what we call tenement living, where we see massive amounts of families and people crowded into very, very small buildings that used to maybe house one apartment for 4 people, now housing like 12 apartments for 4 to 8 people each. Tenement living. We're going to see a massive increase in pollution because of factories that are built near cities. There's no real regulations for how to treat their waste, their runoff, the consequences of their industrial growth, their pollution into the sky. And we're also going to see a huge increase in crime because many people living in the cities are poor, are in and out of work. And cities are also going to be places in which we see a massive growth of vices, right? Societal, quote unquote, sins like gambling, alcoholism, and prostitution, which are all going to be used as marks against continuing immigration, because the American society will argue that immigrants are bringing these sins to society instead of the reality in which the poor working class are using these, quote unquote, I'm not calling them a sin, society is using these sins to escape the reality that they're currently living in. We're going to see a huge lack of sanitation and water treatment. Indoor plumbing does not yet exist. So when we see all these people living in tiny spaces, that's going to lead to a lot of poop. Indoor plumbing, clean water, bacteria, disease, cholera, yellow fever, tuberculosis. In the late 1800s, in cities, 1/4 of babies that are born in urban areas die before the age of 1. So it's a remarkably high rate of what we call infant mortality for all these reasons, right? No access to clean water, because it's very crowded, disease spreads more rapidly, because there's no sanitation, water treatment, there's just more stuff that can get you sick. And local governments are unable to respond effectively to this massive increase in population and size of cities because of the speed at which they grow. Now, one main problem that we're going to talk about that you'll read about, you'll see some pictures of, is going to be called tenement housing. So the landlords that own property in these cities are going to take advantage of the massive demand for their housing to increase their profits by taking inner city housing, right? That might be a one floor apartment and dividing it up as tiny as possible to small windowless rooms so that families of immigrants and Americans are going to rent out a tiny room with up to 8, 10, 12 people that are all sharing maybe an 8x8 or a 12x12 space. And there's no real restrictions against this. We're going to see pictures like this of families that are having their children sleep outside on the fire escape because of living conditions inside. This is a very, very famous picture from a book I'll talk about in a second. It shows a family of Italian immigrants that are crammed into obviously a very small windowless room. I believe in this picture, you can, if you look closely enough, you can see 7 people with all of their belongings. And this is going to actually be exposed in a really, really critical piece of text in this time period from a writer named Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis is going to use photography, which is a relatively new advancement in society, photography and narrative to tell a story that's really accurately named How the Other Half Lives, published in 1889. Now, this is a great text to reference as kind of like why we call this the Gilded Age. When he says the other half, he means not the shiny, glittery half that looks rich and happy and advanced and wealthy and all these good opportunities and big houses and colleges. The other half of society that's not shiny and gold is underneath the surface, and how they're living is pictures like this. These are both pictures from How the Other Half Lives. As is this one, shows a little shanty house built alongside a brick high-rise building in New York City. And all of his text and pictures will come from New York City, but they're going to be indicative of cities all over the country in which conditions are similar: Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, etc., Cincinnati. Here's some more pictures from that text that I think are quite powerful in illuminating kind of the negative consequences of industrial growth and the massive urbanization that society experiences during the Gilded Age. There's a picture for you. Another picture for you. As you can see, they're here with their little stove, keeping things warm with this giant pile of just scrap wood and a whole family. Some good looking feet right there. This whole family sharing this tiny space for their entire existence. How the Other Half Lives. And he tells you, and this is a good little map for how we see the tenement housing divided up, right? What used to be one big apartment for probably a family of 4 gets divided into all these little apartments that all share space, share walls in a really tiny, tiny space. We can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 families sharing space that used to be one family. It tells you the typical tenement, it is generally a brick building, 4 to 6 stories high on the street, frequently with a store on the first floor. 4 families on each floor, a set of rooms consist of 1 or 2 dark closets used as bedrooms, with a tiny living room to be shared. The staircase is dark in the center of the house, and there's no direct ventilation. There's no fresh air coming through. And each family is separated from the other by just little partitions, which are like hand-built little walls. The tenements are today are New York. There are 3/4 of the population of New York is living in tenements. Now, if we go back to here, right, New York City has 3.5 million people. So 3/4 of those people are living in tenements. That's almost 3 million Americans that are living in conditions as he describes and as you saw in those pictures. So urban conditions are a problem. This has contributed for a lot of things: rapid growth, the fact that industrial owners aren't paying good wages, the fact that government is not stepping in to help these people. There's going to be 3 main responses for you to be aware of regarding urbanization and these problems that I've just described. The first is going to be urban reform with a new movement called the social gospel. Social gospel is really critical because it brings a good continuity for you of reformers when the government's not fixing problems in society. Think about antebellum reforms after the Second Great Awakening with abolition, of slavery and temperance for alcohol and education reform and prison reform. This is a good legacy of that. Social gospel is going to, just like that did for many of these reform movements, use religion to try to justify fixing problems in society. Now, it is the social gospel movement that first coins the phrase, which is common in society today, what would Jesus do? This question of like, would Jesus in biblical teachings allow these poor people to just languish in terrible living conditions, or would he get involved to try to fix these problems with and for them? The social gospel movement, thus, is going to be like the opposite of the gospel of wealth, right? Gospel of wealth is like, I got rich, I provided opportunities, and society should thank me for it. Social gospel instead is going to get their hands dirty, so to speak, and trying to get to the bottom of society's problems and fix them from the ground up. The main solution associated with the social gospel is settlement houses, which are just what they say, large houses that are going to help immigrants settle into American society. They're going to be established in poor, urban, immigrant-heavy neighborhoods in big cities all across America, most famously in New York City and Chicago, the two biggest cities in America at the time. And they're going to provide resources for recently arrived immigrants, education, daycare, health services, English lessons, job support, so that these families can assimilate into American society a little more easily. They're going to be largely staffed by middle-class volunteers, largely women. Again, another strong continuity in American social history of women embracing opportunities and reform in social progress because they're largely locked out of opportunities in economics or politics. The best example I can give you that you should most always associate with social gospel and settlement houses is a woman named Jane Addams. Jane Addams, and the project she begins, here's the picture of it, which is Hull House in Chicago. And when asked, what are you doing with these settlement houses? She says, we're trying to teach by example, right? To teach these poor people, these poor immigrants who are struggling by example, to practice cooperation, shared responsibility, and to practice social democracy, right? That what's good for one group in society is good for everybody if things are shared. That is egalitarian, good for everybody, democratic, and shows social relations across class lines. That last part is pivotal, that it could be the responsibility of people who are not lower class to interact with those who are and do what they can to uplift and support them. It is out of the social gospel movement that we see, for example, formed the YMCA and the YWCA, the Young Men's/Women's Christian Association, as well as an important charity that still exists in our world today, the Salvation Army. We had Christmas recently, and you saw the little Santas, maybe that's at the grocery store, ringing the bell, Salvation Army, that still try to do the same thing of building opportunities and resources and supports for those in society who need it, whether it be in the YMCA, activities and education and resources for young men and women, so they can have access to things, and the Salvation Army, which is much more of a charity. Now, the second response to immigration and urbanization is going to be a little similar, but a lot different. Going back to urban reform, it's important that we note that the social gospel and these settlement houses, they didn't ask anything of these immigrants in return for their services, right? They're done because of this idea of, quote unquote, what would Jesus do? So while there, of course, is many elements of racism and classism present, this is not a negotiated bargain between two groups. This is instead a middle-class white attempt to Christianize, assimilate, and support immigrants into urban society. Similar to that, but a little different, is political machines. Now, political machines are also going to do similar to the social gospel, settlement houses, and give immigrants resources. But they're going to ask something in return. That's going to be the big pivotal difference. Political machines in places like New York City and Philadelphia and Chicago are going to provide services for immigrants: jobs, housing, food, groceries, coal to heat their homes, resources. They're going to provide things for immigrants that have recently come to America, but In return, they're going to demand that these immigrants vote for their preferred political candidates for local office, right? Mayors, city council, local judges, local politics. So these immigrants are going to receive these resources that they need and then basically trade back their vote in return. In exchange, these immigrants are going to vote for the machine's candidates for public office. That's going to get a bunch of corrupt people elected to office in these cities. And these corrupt people who are elected because of trading votes for resources are going to use their corruption to enrich themselves, to make themselves rich and make their supporters rich as well. Right. So if I run for office as a machine candidate, right, and all the immigrants vote for me because they're told by their local boss who gave them their resources, vote for Winch, then I go to office. Now I'm the mayor, and now I hire contractors to do city jobs, right? Build a new city hall, build a bridge, build a library, and I charge way more money than that job actually costs. Who pays that? The taxpayer. I can kick back to my people, and we all get rich and happy because of these immigrant votes who are being bought, basically. They're preferred contractors for city jobs. And this is a great example right here. That New York City, according to this cartoon, is under the thumb, meaning under the control of one man named William Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed is a good example for this here. And this is kind of how it looks, right? All these city dwellers are working class immigrants. They don't understand the idea of democracy, so they're more than happy. It's not their fault. More than happy to trade their vote for resources that they need. So they vote and vote and vote. It says people come out to vote early and often. They're voting at the instruction of their ward, their neighborhood boss, who receives instructions from the machine boss. They vote and vote and vote and vote and vote. And now in city government, the city government's going to give contracts for city jobs to construction companies, to suppliers, and that contract's going to pay way more than needed to complete the job. And that extra money is then kicked back to the machine. And that money is then used to give resources back to the immigrants. So it allows local politics to be run by corrupt officials and who are getting rich off of the fact that these immigrants are trading their votes for resources. It's not just New York City. Many city governments are run by political machines, but because these machine politicians, they have access to all the city jobs, all the business licenses, all the building projects, they tend to be quite corrupt. These politicians are going to use fraud, we just talked about, to win their elections, and then once elected, use their influence for personal gain and taking bribes from businesses to get their way. Right, here's Chicago. Taking all these campaign funds to contracts for jobs, the machine. Here's Boss Tweed in New York City, standing by the ballot box, making sure that these immigrants and these other urban dwellers vote for the candidate that they said to vote for. And he is the most famous urban corrupt politician, Boss Tweed, of what's called the Tammany Hall. Both this is like the most important SFI to lock in for political machines is Boss Tweed. And Tammany Hall is the name of their machine. And they're going to run New York City politics for a long time, as well as also eventually New York state level politics as well. The Tweed Ring is going to actually defraud by charging way more for projects than they needed to be paid for. They're going to defraud New York City taxpayers of millions of dollars until eventually being exposed by a really pivotal name to know for today, Thomas Nast, who's going to use political cartoons to show American society what's happening in New York politics. This is a Nast cartoon, which he shows Boss Tweed as only being run by money. This is also a Nast cartoon. You can see his name right there, which shows New York City's over here, New Jersey's here thriving. They got schools, they got factories, they got commerce, trade, and homes, and New York's stuck under the thumb of Boss Tweed. So he's going to use the visual medium of political cartoons to expose Boss Tweed as a corrupt politician who's defrauding the city of New York for millions of dollars. And here's one last fantastic cartoon that shows the Tammany Hall. Again, I wish I was in class to analyze this with you together, but it's a great visual that shows there's Boss Tweed up there, kind of as a Roman king watching his machine, his tiger, the Tammany tiger, kill the Statue of Liberty, basically, right? Lady Liberty, kill the ballot box, kill the Republic in the name of machine politics to get his way. So that's the second response to immigration, is machine politics. It's important that you understand how that's related to immigration and urbanization and the problems that are created. And the third reaction to increased immigration is nativism, which we've already talked about. Now, we're going to see nativism expressed in two different ways. The first is by organized labor unions and movements. Now, labor activists, labor leaders are going to be anti-immigrant for a couple reasons. Reason one, they fear job competition, right? The way in which labor unions work is they make it so that they are hard to replace. More immigrants coming to America means that they are easier to replace, so they're going to fear job competition. Now, some ask, why didn't these labor unions just include immigrants in the union and that'd be even stronger? Good question. Reason one, oftentimes there's language barriers that are going to keep from allowing immigrants from joining labor unions, but also labor unions are going to actively pass restrictions to keep immigrants from joining. Third reason, immigrants are often hired as strike breakers, meaning if all of us in class went on strike, we're not going to work unless they fix our wages. The industrial class is going to often just go to cities and hire immigrants who are going to break the strike by just going to work for less money anyway, which is going to lead to further hostility towards immigrants. We're also going to see government acting to restrict immigration. In 1882, the government is going to ban any criminals, excessively poor people, and later alcoholics and sick people from coming to America in an attempt to try to fix some of these problems they see in cities. And also in 1882, largely due to anti-immigrant activists in California, the federal government is going to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is going to suspend all Chinese immigration for 10 years. And then it gets prolonged another 10 years, another 10 years, another 10 years before finally being revoked during World War II in 1943. So this is a nice little chart that I made up for you real quick. We see responses to immigration by both supporters, people who support immigrants, and nativists. Right, supporters, we see like the social gospel, settlement houses that are trying to do good by immigrants via that religious ideology of fixing society. Political machines, less good, still trying to do good by immigrants, but in exchange for votes, which corrupts the political process. And then nativists, right? The social Darwinism element we've already talked about, that immigrants are less than in society and thus should not be supported. And also immigration restrictionists like labor unions and the federal government banning Chinese immigration and others. Fun little flow chart there for you. So the big takeaway I want for you to come away with today is as follows. The massive industrialization that we've been talking about in this unit would not have been possible without immigrants. Businesses need these immigrants as both a source of labor to work and a source of market to purchase. Immigrant volume, how many immigrants come, is going to impact the labor movement by weakening the collective movement, by making workers more easily replaced, and impacts politics as both political parties like the Democrats and political machines in cities prey on immigrant needs for support, often at the expense of democratic values, right? Specifically, the way that political machines are going to corrupt the democratic process by trading resources for votes in a way that thus is anti-democracy. So I got some text for you to look at that kind of talk about immigrants and urban living situations and the settlement houses and the social gospel. So use those texts to further deepen your understanding of all of these elements of society in the Gilded Age. And as always, just shoot me an email if there's anything you need. Love y'all, and I will see you on Friday.